A few years ago, ideas that we talked about were thought to be fringe ideas, radical ideas, extremist ideas. Those ideas are now mainstream.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
One way you get rid of Trump is a crashing economy, so please bring on the recession.
When was the last time an actor assassinated the president?
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
An individual came up to us and asked us whether they were Republicans or Democrats on the field. Jeff told them it was Republicans.
A top US Republican and some of his aides have been shot during baseball practice.
The suspect identified as James Hodgkinson.
James Hodgkinson from Belleville, Illinois, had some strong political views.
I've just been informed that the alleged shooter at the Republican baseball practice this morning is someone who apparently volunteered on my presidential campaign.
One Facebook group Hodgkinson belonged to was actually called Terminate the Republican Party.
Who is this guy?
Youth throughout the world likes to make jokes using popular symbols of the past. While the Nazi swastika is considered to be a bad joke, Soviet symbols are not. Communism, after all, was not Nazism. It was about equality and harmony. There was nothing wrong with the idea itself. Well, actually, there was. There was something which made it different from the other utopias. Lenin believed in what he called the war of classes, which meant that the ultimate harmony can only be reached after certain groups of people are killed.
Initially, when communists come to power, and that doesn't matter where, let it be in Russia, in Poland, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, it doesn't matter, in China. Initially, they destroy about 10% of population, and that's very specific. This is used not just to kill enemies, they're not enemies, it's to restructure the fabric of society. It's a social engineering. Top intellectuals, best workers, best engineers, they would kill them all. And then they will try to restructure the new society.
Hang at least 100 kulaks, execute the hostages, do it in such a way that people for hundreds of miles around will see and tremble. Lenin. In 1917, the communists seized power. Lenin now had a chance to apply Marxism to real life.
Those who resisted were shot. There were terrible massacres against resisting peasants. And again, nobody knows exactly how many people died, but we're talking about 10 million or more.
Soviet society was the first communist society on Earth. It was a huge social experiment. The agonizing death of 7 million Ukrainians had a wider meaning in the distorted vision of the communist architects.
You have to make the revolution, then establish the dictatorship of proletariat, and then the birth of the new man can be possible.
The birth of the new man was the ultimate aim of Marxism, breeding a new evolutionary form of human being who will think, look, and act differently. But communists were not alone in this endeavor.
Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen erziehen und zu einer neuen Lebensform zu führen.
Hitler's National Socialism was also about creating a new man.
In both systems, you have an ideology which which has the ambition of creating a new man. That means that both systems don't agree with human nature as it is. They are at war with nature, with human nature. This is the root of totalitarianism. And you find it both in Nazi. In Nazi, it's an ideology based on false biology, and communism is based on false sociology. But both systems have an ambition of being scientific and resting on a scientific basis.
I don't think many people know that only socialists publicly advocated genocide in the 19th, 20th centuries. I think that's a very little known fact, and it seems shocking if you mention it. I've lectured on it here and in other universities, and it's always greeted with a sense of shock.
The classes and the races, too weak to master the new conditions of life, must give way. They must perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. Karl Marx.
Marx began it. He was the ancestor of a modern political genocide, and I don't know that any European thinker of the modern period before Marx and Engels ever publicly advocated racial extermination. I can't find anything earlier, so I presume it starts with them.
The teachings of Marx and Engels were carefully studied by Lenin, the man who established the first Marxist country on earth. 1 year after Lenin's death in 1924, the New York Times published a small article, which at the time went almost unnoticed. It was about some newly established party in Germany. The National Socialist Labour Party, of which Adolf Hitler is patron and father, persists in believing that Lenin and Hitler can be compared. Who's speaking? A certain Dr. Goebbels. On the speaker's assertion that Lenin was the greatest man, second only to Hitler, and that the difference between communism and the Hitler faith was very slight, a faction war opened with whizzing beer glasses. Amazing. The future Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels was openly declaring that the difference between Lenin's communism and the Hitler faith was very slight. As we read, it didn't go down well with potential voters, so the Nazis changed their tactics. Their early campaign posters quietly disappeared. They never again publicly stressed their resemblance to communists. In the inner circle, however, the Nazis and Hitler were more outspoken.
Hitler often said that he had learnt a great deal from Marxism, from reading Marx, I mean. The whole of National Socialism is based upon it, he said, meaning doctrinally based.
People keep forgetting that Nazi regime in Germany was also socialist. It was, they officially were called National Socialist Workers' Party. So it's a branch of socialism. The Soviets were international socialists, and those were in Germany, National Socialists. So it's the same thing in reality, only slightly different interpretation.
Part of the left went to Hitler. At least in France, part of the socialists went to became advocates of Hitler.
The popular British playwright Bernard Shaw supported Hitler in the mass media. The left supported Hitler not because he deceived them. They knew Hitler would kill. He said he would. In fact, it was why they supported him.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
Bernard Shaw believed in mass killing by category, not usually by racial category, but by category, you know, the idle, the unfit.
Killing off the parasites within society was what Marxian socialism was about.
He demanded in a London newspaper that the scientists should devise a humane gas.
I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly. Deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel. After 10 years, such gas will be discovered. It will be called Zyklon B. The man who oversaw its practical application, Adolf Eichmann, will later testify that thanks to Zyklon B, people in Auschwitz died without pain. Zyklon B was a humane gas. Yes, Eichmann will use the very same words. It must be said, though, that Bernard Shaw, as well as the left in general, fundamentally opposed Nazism, because Hitler had distorted Marxism beyond recognition. Gassing people based on their nationality was absolutely inexcusable. The selection should be based on class. Hitler got it all wrong. Absolutely different people needed to be killed. The only true Marxist country on earth was the Soviet Union. It exterminated strictly according to Marxist teaching, the class enemies. In general, the process was pretty similar to the extermination of the Jews. First, the victims were ridiculed and publicly humiliated. And then they were killed. Millions of them.
Ведут сейчас с нами вместе разоблачить и еще можем больше разоблачить, которые остались. Никто не стесняйтесь, не бойтесь.
If the enemy does not give up, it must be exterminated.
People were being shot day and night throughout the biggest country in the world. Stalin even got to the point of killing people by random, by quotas.
Let's say 100,000 in Tambov district. Okay, that's it. Whoever they grabbed and shot will be fulfilling quota. They wouldn't care about names. Then after the quotas were fulfilled, the local authorities would report to Stalin, to Central Committee, and asked for additional quotas. An additional quota will be given, and after fulfilling, they would again ask for additional quota, and so it will go in circles. It was like mincemeat machine, you know, it was just killing and killing and killing.
For Mao, communism could be achieved only through radical means, through continuing revolution, a never-ending process of struggle and change. Through the columns of China's main newspaper, He called on young people to attack party officials and replace them with true revolutionaries. Mao Zedong had unleashed the great proletarian cultural revolution.
For the first time since 1949, our supreme leader, Chairman Mao, a godlike figure, called on people at the very bottom of society, people like us students with no work and no profession. He told us to rebel against party officials. This had a tremendous impact on us.
Young people took to the streets. They wrote wall posters attacking their teachers and party officials. Within days, schools and universities were in turmoil.
Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel.
Students banded together to carry out Mao's orders. They called themselves Red Guards. In September 1966, schools did not open for the academic year.
This was the first chance we had to break away from our parents, to do whatever we wanted.
Mao encouraged the Red Guards to attack Western influences and to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Without this destruction, he said, socialism cannot be achieved. The Red Guards tore down street signs and put up new revolutionary names. They ransacked museums, libraries, and temples. They searched and looted people's homes.
There was no reason for it. My children were scared to death, shaking with fear.
Students were used to carry the cultural revolution forward. For the first time, young people were encouraged to attack authority and the old hierarchy of the party. And the advice came from Mao himself. Bombard the headquarters, he said. To rebel is justified. This time, it wasn't the peasants in the country who did his bidding. The most educated and energetic generation in China was following his every word. The students felt excited and liberated as never before. The rising fervor was directed at Mao's rivals, including President Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Banners attacked Liu. Even small children were taught to denounce Liu. In schools, pupils attacked their teachers. In Shanghai, the teacher who taught her class to love Mao was now accused of being disloyal.
There were several hundred Red Guards wearing armbands. Others had military belts. Some had scissors in their hands, ready to cut people's hair. They chopped off my hair and beat me with sticks. They ordered me to produce the Red Book and to recite that revolution means rebellion and violence. That day I was wearing a white shirt without pockets, so I wasn't carrying the Red Book with me. They said, if you're not carrying the Red Book, that means you aren't loyal to Chairman Mao. How dare you say you love Chairman Mao? You deserve to be overthrown. They ordered me to stand outside the playground from morning to night. But then they thought the punishment wasn't severe enough, so they got a big blackboard and pressed it down on me. They wanted to knock me down and keep me down forever.
Xiao Ailing was left with permanent injuries to her face. Up to 1 million were killed or driven to suicide. The country was now in the grip of a revolutionary mania that became more and more violent and destructive. The Red Guards attacked the four olds: old habits, old ideas, old customs, old culture. Books were burned and museums pillaged. The anarchy spread. Schools and hospitals closed. Offices and factories were in chaos.
In China, fathers and sons traditionally have close ties. But now you had to end your relationship. It was really sad, but you just had to do it.
Throughout China, party officials, intellectuals, people with foreign connections, former businessmen, millions were paraded and beaten in public. It is estimated that at least 400,000 people were killed.
We called him Secretary Zhang. He was the secretary at the state farm where my mother had worked. When the Cultural Revolution came, the Red Guards and workers dragged him out to struggle with. He was forced to kneel on the ground, on sand, broken stones, and glass, for more than 2 hours. He knelt with a heavy board hanging from his neck. It had his name written on it, with red crosses through it. That's how someone who was going to be shot was treated.
Chairman Mao had said, a revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not a dinner party. We had to be rough and harsh and wild.
In my class, there was a student whose grandfather had owned a big fabric store, so he was a capitalist. I heard that everyone was to go to their house to criticize him. I got there late, and by the time I arrived, the capitalist had been beaten to death. I remember that his head was all swollen and dark and bruised. All those people beat him to death, including his own granddaughter, my classmate.
We organized our own Red Guards. We called ourselves the Red Guards of Mao Zedong thought. We were part of the rebels. We made armbands the same as the others. You say you're defending Chairman Mao? Okay, so am I. You're making revolution? So am I. Before and after every action, we used Mao's songs and quotations to encourage ourselves. Be resolute, be daring, overcome all obstacles, and be victorious.
In Beijing, embassies were attacked. Rebel factions occupied the foreign ministry for 2 weeks.
I was a little disgusted with the cult of Mao, and I said a few things. So I was labeled a reactionary student. At school, they held several criticism meetings against me. What was most unbearable, and even today still makes me uncomfortable, was that none of my friends would speak to me. I became totally isolated.